begin with the second session of this Oxford Girona encounter, and in this session we have Professor Lester Green, with professor at the University of Oxford, and he works about he worked a lot about legal positivism argument, etc. And today he presents a work about law as a means. This is the title. Nothing. I would agree, Leslie, for this kind acceptation of our invitation. With kind. Thank I would thank Leslie for this kind acceptance of our invitation, and I hope there is no the first, but only the first time of life in Girona.
Well, Jordi, thank you very much. And let me join John in thanking all of you for your hospitality and your hard work on these kind of ragged and some ways different papers. A common suspicion circulates around the rest of the world that in England we think that legal philosophy started in 1961. And I'm one of the people that work in England that think it started either in 1935 or 1925, depending which you take to be the more important of Kelsen's first two works. And I want to defend for you today a Kelsenian thesis that doesn't get as much attention as I think it should, and indeed a thesis that divided in some ways Hart himself and Kelsen. The formulation that I like most is actually in the general theory of law in the state, not in the earlier works, where Kelsen says, law is a means, a specific social means, and not an end. And I don't have a demonstration of this thesis. Those of you who've had a chance to read the paper will know that we get to the end and there's no positive argument in favor of this thesis. The way I try to gain some traction is twofold: to show you that it is an interpretation of a broader thesis that is actually not rejected by any legal philosopher of significance. Realize we might disagree about who's of significance, but those thought to reject it don't reject it. So that's the first move, and it's sort of an historical step. And then what I try to do is just clear away a lot of rubbish that has become attached to the thesis in the last 50 years. And I was provoked to write this partly on the suggestion that we might revisit the Hart-Fuller debate, so there's some discussions about Fuller who rejects this thesis. But also after reading Brian Manaha's rather peculiar book called the same title as Laws and Ends and Instrumentalism and How It's Destroying Legality and so forth. And by the time I finished the book, I wasn't really sure what thesis he had in mind, but I knew it wasn't the thesis I had in mind. So the first bit of it, as I say, is sort of historical and trying to place Kelsen's thesis, and the second is to try to defend it by indirection, to try to persuade you, if you're not already persuaded, that things commonly associated with the thesis. Now what's going to happen next? I'm trying to get it. I knew that this would happen, didn't I, John?
You did say.
No. We started well, and then we had a slight hiatus of you. No. Yeah, from beginning. Right. So the instrumentalist conception of law, the conception that I claim anyway, is not controversial as this one. Law involves various means that are intended to, or just as often have the result of serving social and individual ends. And I don't mean anything technical by ends, so I'm not excluding certain deontic states or consequential of rights or anything like that. And I've made the instrumental conception as vague as I can by just saying involves. It involves it. Different views will interpret the involvement of law with the world of means and ends in different ways. And in the full paper, I set out a whole list of people that unquestionably accept the thesis at the top, or not thesis, the conception at the top. And they go from the usual suspects, Aquinas, unsurprisingly, with following Aristotle, the teleological view about law. Bentham, everybody knows, took an instrumentalist view of law. Austin followed Bentham. Van Ehring, nobody reads Ehring anymore, but his Recht als Zweck, which was his life's work at the end, a massive 1,000-page treatise on the laws and means and ends, set us right on that view. Marx took the same view. Law was a device used to mask, mystify the relations of production. Weber, of course, thought it was a means to a variety of bureaucratic rational ends. Kelsen was the one who formulated the thesis. And oddly enough, Fuller, who opposed Kelsen, as I try to show anyway in the oh, I see. The right mouse button is not where I expect it to be. All right. Fuller's complaint. Some endorse a contrasting thesis, or at any rate, they think it's contrasting, that rejects Kelsen's emphasis on the means when we try to identify law, and Fuller's one of them. And according to Fuller, what's objected to by the instrumentalist thesis, what he thinks Kelsen and Hart and all the others think is wrong, is not the assignment of purposes to a particular laws. Common lawyers and civilians are used all the time to try and work out what the purpose of a statute is or what the point of a whole body of legislation or doctrine is, but rather, says Fuller, to law as a whole. So Fuller sees this as the dividing line, as indeed do some others, including John Finnis. So we can set up, broadly speaking, a tension or a contrast between two different interpretations of what I call the instrumentalist conception. And I'm just going to treat these as two instrumentalisms, and now the argument starts to get going for serious. And notice that I framed it, unlike Kelsen's rather bold way, much more modestly. Simply an essential part of explaining the nature of law requires an understanding of the way law serves as means to ends, because, so it's not all of a theory, even of identifying law, it's just an essential part of it. And then we have two options. One is the version that I endorse, and that I think quite a lot of the authors endorse. So I'm going to call type A, law has species typical means of pursuing various ends. What do I mean by species typical means? Well, a variety of things, imposing obligations, conferring rights, powers, duties, and doing so through rules that have a variety of social sources and are subject to authoritative determination by institutions. Familiar picture. And means here are in the plural. Law doesn't just have one means, contrary to what Kelsen thought. That was a mistake. It's got a number of tools in its armamentarium of pursuing various ends. So the top plus A is the thesis in full form that I want to defend. You'll see it's a fairly modest thesis. Notwithstanding that, there are those who will disagree with it. And here we have it in form B. And this is the form that we inherit from Aquinas and Aristotle. John Finnis is the most influential contemporary advocate of the second form of instrumentalism. So we just omit A. An essential part of explaining the nature of law requires understanding the way law serves as means to ends, because law has species typical end. And here I framed it in the singular. You could imagine a weaker version still that was Hart's, that said there were, set of species typical ends, the minimal content thesis, as Hart called it. And it adds something further. It says, and that explains why law does and should embrace various means. So there's a passage I cite in the paper from Aquinas. He says, think about a saw. How do we explain the features that a saw has? Well, a saw is for cutting. And because it's for cutting, we can understand structural features about saws, like, for example, have to easily held and have teeth and be sharp and so forth. And by analogy, argues Fuller, it's not just some kind of accident that when we look around legal systems the world about, we see familiar institutional structures. We find primary organs that identify and apply the law. We find enforcement agencies. We find hierarchies of norms. This is not accidental. Just like the teeth on a saw, these are there for a purpose, and we can explain and understand that purpose. Fuller makes a very rash claim, I think. He says only by imputing to the law a species-typical end. If it didn't have a common and stable end, we would expect all sorts of legal systems to look radically different. And they don't, in fact, look radically different. They look a bit different, but they're structural commonalities. So, because of the function of law, we can explain the stable structural commonalities that we in fact find, and only because of the function of law, imputation of that function, can we explain the structural commonalities that we find. Law would be higgledy-piggledy. It would be a jumble, different everywhere, if it weren't always aiming at an end, or, as I said, in a weaker sense, a compact set of ends. So those are the two versions, and the version I want to defend mainly against objections is the first. Now, I want to be clear about the sort of thesis I'm fishing for in this paper, because it won't have failed to cross your mind, even from the slide, that instrumentalisms A and B are consistent. They could both be true. And that they're bilaterally independent, by which I mean the truth of one doesn't entail the truth of the other, or vice versa. So I'm well aware of that, and so are some of the writers in the tradition. I think Kelsen is aware that this is consistent with the possibility that law has an end. I think it doesn't have an end. So the claim I want to make about these two versions of instrumentalism are the following. First, that the version I favor, Kelsen's version, has explanatory priority. I'll say a little bit about that in identifying the law of a society, and anyway, B is false. So the demonstration that B is false is not complete in this paper, but I've, some of you know, written too much probably about the falsity of the orientation of law to a single overarching end. Explanatory priority. Well, there are a number of things that go into identifying the law of a given society. In fact, it's a common mistake we explored a little bit this morning with John's paper to think that the rule of recognition, if there be such a thing, does a whole lot more work than it really does a bit of work. But as among the instrumentalisms on the table, A has priority over B in explaining it. So B might be true. I'm asserting it's not true. But if it's true, we gain more explanatory traction. We're able to explain more features of law and identify law as a result of A than B. So it's a priority thesis and not... Now, I have to introduce, I'm afraid, some of the technical machinery of this paper. I apologize for this because now that once I said it all out, I realized some of it probably is, are not moving parts, but decorative parts, at least for this paper, but I need them for other things. So there's probably more here than I strictly need to prosecute the argument. So laws about the meaningful world of ends and means, say I and Weber and lots of other people. But we need to get clear a little bit, I think, about means and ends. And certainly in reading Fuller, quite a lot of confusion, I think, is cast by his occasional misidentification of law's means with its ends. He thinks what you and I would ordinarily think are the means of law are the ends of law. In fact, the famous line often quoted is that the function of law is to subject human conduct to the governance of rules, Fuller says. That's the purpose of law. But that's not the purpose of law. It's how law does whatever purposes it has. So I'm going to just legislatively, stipulatively, but not without some rationale behind it, order these concepts in the following way. I'm going to say L, this is just ranging over laws for now. Let's not worry about legal systems or fields of doctrine. L has instrumental value only if it's a means to a valuable end, E. So I'll comment on that, which is elaborated at some length in the paper. It would be natural to suppose that a law has instrumental value whenever it is a best or efficient means to E. And indeed, Kelsen himself strenuously argues for this. He thinks that there is no other sort of value law can have, and we identify law's instrumental value by identifying that to which it is an efficient end. These, for Kelsen, aren't always causal relations. Sometimes they are internal relations. So, if L is a way of realizing L prime, then with respect to L prime, or as he says, relative to L prime, L is good. But there's something very peculiar about that way of thinking about it. We may want to talk about that in the discussion, and I try to elaborate it in that section of the paper. But just informally, think of it this way. Suppose that the end we had in mind were utterly valueless. So we take any of the familiar examples. My favorite is Philippa Foot's. I think it's Philippa Foot's, or is it Anscombe's? I forgot who had it first. I think it may be Anscombe. Satisfying a desire for a saucer of mud. You say to someone, well, what do you want the saucer of mud for? And say, nothing at all. What, do you think of it as good? No, I don't see it under the aspect of the good. Does it give you pleasure to satisfy the desire? No, I just satisfy desire. This is an end that has no value. It's a valueless end. And more efficient ways of providing saucers of mud don't provide instrumental value on my account. Now, as I said, that's not demonstrated in there. I just motivated with a few examples, counting blades of grass. So that's the first thing. Instrumental value is a means to a valuable end. Yeah. Yes.
Only if it is conditional or biconditional?
It's meant to be biconditional. But the only half of the biconditional I need is that conditional. I don't rely on the other one. L is a means to E. Now I'm using means in what I take to be the ordinary sense of the term here. If E is either a causal consequence or logical result of adopting, using, engaging with, whatever, L. So that's what it is for one thing to be means to another. So notice that I'm here counting as means not only things that stand in causal relation, injecting more money into the economy as a means of reflating demand, but also things that are logical upshots of doing something. All right? Playing both repeats is a means of realizing Bach's intention in the well-tempered clavier. It's not a causal product of it, it's a way of doing it. And there can be other non-causal relations. So means, as I understand it, is a broader term than instruments, and the key here is to, if we interpret, why am I drawing this distinction? Well, if we insist very broadly on means, it starts to look uninteresting to say that law is a means, because you get to be a means in all kinds of easy ways, and I don't want the easy ways to be allowed in. So I'm going to say L is an instrument. Instruments now are a subset of means, only if, and this is merely a necessary condition, only if L is subject to the intentional control in bringing about some E event, and they're not the same, and E is a causal consequence and not a logical result of adopting, etc., using L. So instruments for me are subsets of means which have two features. They're subject to intentional control. Now let me say something about subject to. That means something like capable of being controlled by human attention, engagement, effort. Doesn't mean they necessarily arose that way. And in the paper I suggest, the example in the paper is inapposite. In this version of the example, I say that an objet trouvé can be a means, and then I give you the example, an incorrect example in the paper of a customary rule. It's picked up and used, but of course it does satisfy this condition, or at least this condition broadly construed. But you can imagine other things that just find and we subject them to our control, and we use them. A chipped bone, could be used as an auger or something. And so I'm not going to allow the thesis to get true merely because some L's, when engaged with by people, produce other laws. So the mere fact if it be a fact that law regulates its own creation, is not going to establish the thesis as far as I'm concerned. Not interested in that part of that's true, but that doesn't establish the thesis. Now, as I said, I've had numerous discussions about that way of ordering the terms, and for today's purpose, I prefer just to treat them legislatively. That's how I'm going to use end, and I'm going to treat instrument as a subset of means, and I'm going to be interested in instrumental thesis only in the narrower sense. Well, now I have to talk about value. So I said something about what instrumental value was. And for tidiness, I'm going to say that non-instrumental value is what sometimes goes under the head intrinsic value. So I'm just going to treat these as exclusive. Many people use intrinsic value in a different way. That's fine. We can carve up the territory if we need to some other way. But now I need a distinction. Either because, first of all, L, the law, the field of doctrine, the statute, whatever, has what I call dependent value. It's a value for or to something capable of appreciating the value it has. So the example in the paper is a beautiful sunset. A beautiful sunset is of intrinsic value, not just instrumental value. Why? Well, for one thing, sunsets aren't instruments because they're not means to anything and they can't be subject to our intentional control. But here you see there's an internal relation between it having value and there being an appreciating subject. And I'm going to leave wide open what appreciating subjects are. Let's start with people. So you can be of intrinsic value if it is a value for or to something capable of appreciating the value it has. Or, and this is the hard one, about which I've just sketched a few remarks in the paper, it has freestanding value, has non-instrumental value that's not dependent. Now you might be some people doubt that there are such values. They say no, all intrinsic values are dependent for their existence on an agent, person capable of appreciating them or engaging with them. But I incline, this is the only point in which I think I'm tempted by Kantianism, I incline to the view that persons have a kind of value that's not like sunsets. Explaining that is very hard. I've written another paper recently trying to come to grips with one explanation of the notion that persons are of value for their own sake. B, happily, although it's the most difficult part of the value theory, doesn't matter, because it would be crazy to think that law is of value for its own sake. And when you look at the people who have criticized instrumentalism, and I have that, I think, charming quotation from McTaggart that says, if you believe that laws have non-instrumental value, you might as well think that sewer pipes have non-instrumental value. Talking about the state. But of course, McTaggart there is making B point. He's saying that it would be daft to think that laws have value for its own sake. A freestanding intrinsic value. So I think that we needn't worry too much about B, although I do spend some time trying to eject it from the horizon, and we ought to focus instead on A. Could it be possible that law has non-instrumental value that's dependent for its value on things like us, things capable of appreciating the sort of intrinsic value it has? And as you know, very shortly I come back to rely on this to defeat one of the fallacies. Well, I think the fallacies. Now I need to introduce a warning. This warning is needed only if there's a Fullerian in the room. Probably there aren't. Fullerians are a rightly endangered species. Their ecological niche has evaporated and they no longer can live in the new bold world of legal philosophy. But if you're tempted to think that, hang on, I know all about Green, he's a positivist and a Kelsenian and so on, and this is just positivism, you need to notice that this is not. A theory of law is instrumentalist if it maintains that law is an instrument, in the sense defined, right? So I have a narrow, special definition of an instrument. A theory of law is positivist on my account only if it maintains that all law is a human artifact. Or, as we used to say, more compactly, all law is positive law. So after all, how it got the name. I believe both of those theses to be true, but the warning is at the foot. An instrument need not be an artifact. Legal instrumentalism is not legal positivism. Now, that shouldn't come as a surprise to you once you remember that on the list of legal instrumentalists, we also had Aquinas and Aristotle and all those people who believed in teleological views about law. But this is a commonly made mistake, and those of you who have had the misfortune of struggling through Brian Tananaha's book will see that it appears in places, and it clouds Fuller's understanding of what the issue is between him and Hart. It's part of Fuller's reason for denying instrumentalism, because he doesn't want to be a positivist, and he thinks if you accept it, you'll... but as I say, this is not an argument, it's just a warning. You need to add a further proposition. No reason so far in the definition. Something may be not made by man or people or engaged with by people, but used. Picked up, grabbed a hold of, and put to use by them. And I think at points that's the right way to understand someone like Aquinas. Well, now I think that instrumentalism is on the table as a candidate. I'm skating, of course, over some complications in the paper, but that's the fun of slides. As one of my old philosophy tutors used to say, when the ice gets thin, skate quickly. So I'm skating over some complications. And I want to now defend it by indirection, showing that the 5 fallacies, and I've just gone fallacy gathering through the literature, the things that seem to persuade people, students, writers, that an instrumentalist view, a thoroughly instrumentalist view of law is misleading. And for the logicians in the crowd, let me point out that I'm using fallacy here in the informal sense. These are just bad mistakes that are commonly entrenched. Some of them also involve fallacies of affirming the consequent and equivocation and so forth, but I'm just helping myself to fallacies. Bad mistakes not to be made. So the first one is a very common one, and Kelsen makes it. If law is an instrument, then law can have no non-instrumental value. And it was a matter of great grief to me when I discovered that Kelsen, who discovered this important general feature of law, that law can be identified by its means but not its end, went on to support this by a ridiculous argument showing that law could never have any non-instrumental value. And then that, of course, gave rise to a whole set of equally ridiculous refutations of that ridiculous thesis. But I think law can have non-instrumental value, although not non-instrumental value of the freestanding kind, but of the dependent kind. And the examples I give, when I thought of these, they struck me as utterly uncontroversial, but every time I've read the paper, I've come to think, well, maybe they are controversial, but just seems so to me. One of them is what I call the genealogical value of law. The law now in force, of course, didn't spring into existence a moment ago. It had a history. Every nation's law is path dependent. It reflects political events, special courses of action of that nation's history. We know that we can't determine the identity criteria of a legal system over time without reference to political events and political conditions. And people value these things. So, for example, Canadians take great pride in the fact that they attained lawful independence from Britain without a revolution. And unlike the bad Americans who shed blood when you could have done it all perfectly lawfully. And you might find that major non-instrumental value to think that we were the peaceable kingdom, which was the title of a high school history textbook current many years ago in Canada. The peaceable kingdom because we did what the Americans did without all the wars. We only had to fight wars once, and that was in those days, and that was with the Americans. Keep them out. So this just doesn't follow. The other one, which is much more interesting, I think, is a time slice of the first, and it's what in the paper I call the organic value of a legal system. So a legal system can also be an aspect of its society. And this is not a new thesis. It's represented in Aristotle. Joseph Raz tries to construct an argument for respect for law on this basis. To say it's an aspect of its society, I just mean that it stands in internal relation to the mores and ways and so forth of its society. And notice I say can have, not must have, because I'm not about to sit and argue that the organic relation between the Nazi legal regime and its society was of non-instrumental dependent value. That was a bad thing, not a good thing. There are also non-independent intrinsic bads. But it can. And so those are two for you to think about. The historical one is a possible example, and the organic one. The second most popular fallacy in the literature is also sadly due to Kelsen, who got so much right. He thought, well, look, law always has some instrumental value. And he didn't mean it for the ordinary reason that you might be tempted to think of. Well, whenever a legal system is effective, surely it does some good or other, even if it's only getting the trains to run on time, Mussolini, right? No, Kelsen thought this true because whenever we had a law, it was authorized by some higher law, and therefore we had something against which we could measure it. We could decide whether it conformed to the higher law, whether it fit within the frame if it was an interpretation, and so on. So he said every law had relative value, and then he had a stronger thesis, many of you know, that's the only kind of value law had. But that's because Kelsen thought that's the only kind of values law that there were. So it didn't surprise him that law always had law relative value. Now I think this is wrong for a reason that is elaborated in the paper but can be stated more shortly. Remember what we said about the saucer of mud. The wrong target is better missed. And if the wrong target is better missed, it's not going to be the case that law always has instrumental value just because it satisfies the Kelsen conditions. If it's not something we should be aiming at in the first place, the fact that we're getting closer to it does not go anywhere to establish this threatening sounding thesis. Also, I note in the paper that sadly Hart was guilty himself of this, I think, in the second degree in his germ of justice thesis, about which I've written elsewhere. And I thought it was an unfortunate accretion to Hart's view that there was always a smidgen of justice being done by law whenever you had law existing, because it always was instrumental in producing a state of affairs where people attend to distribution and treat like cases alike. F3 is the big one, about which I say little in this paper, mainly because I've written extensively about it elsewhere. If law is an instrument, then necessarily there's a generic end that law serves. The person who believes this most fervently, I think you all know, is John Finnis. Following Aquinas, says that law serves the common good, and this becomes a kind of overarching end which explains somehow all the other features of law. I'm not going to repeat the arguments which I've given elsewhere for doubting that it's false. Note, however, that it might be true, and nonetheless the narrow version of the instrumentalist thesis I'm defending might still hold, right? Because remember I said A and B were bilaterally independent. I just said and B is false. So I'm not depending on its falsity, but it is false. And so this is not a fallacy in a strict sense. It's just a dumb thing to think that seems to be popular. And we're nearing the end of the list of fallacies. If you're an instrumentalist, you have to believe that law is a neutral instrument. Here I think maybe we are in the neighborhood of an actual logical fallacy, a fallacy of equivocation. Informal fallacy anyway. Law certainly isn't neutral. Law consists inter alia of norms, and norms direct our behavior or purport to do so or taken as if they do so in one direction rather than the other, so that's not neutral. Because of that, laws are not ideologically neutral or in any interesting sense. It would be nice if laws were neutrally applied, but everybody knows that that's an ideal much aspired to but rarely attained. One thing we might say with Raz is that, well, law's specific virtue, the virtues of legality, are neutral with respect to the end to which law may be put. And maybe Kelsen thought something like that. But that's neutrality in a rather watery sense. And it's possibly liable anyway to the Fuller type objection that, well, you know, some things law is actually not that good for. Some things that can't at any rate directly be served by law. But in any case, we don't have to believe that if we believe law is an instrument. And I think the value of law as an instrument is it happens to be non-neutral and has certain tendencies which are useful. The last one is just bizarre, although And the person that I associate most closely with five, well, there's a couple of people. They tend to be private lawyers. Ernie Weinrib in Toronto thinks that if you thought that tort law was instrumental, you'd have to think tort law was subject only to instrumental assessment. It's a crazy thing to think. Tort law would get to be assessed by the criteria of torthood, and everything else would just become irrelevant. But this is treating value as something like a good species of its kind, or a good specimen. Not moral good or value of good in the sense I have in mind. And anyway, it's obvious enough if you think about it for 2 minutes that something can be an instrument and can be subject to non-instrumental side constraints, right? So scissors are instruments. In fact, I think that it's part of the nature of scissors that they're instruments, and that they have a species-typical function and a species-typical mean, so they're a mixed kind. But also, the use of scissors is subject to non-instrumental evaluation. Like, for example, it's wrong to use scissors to stab people that irritate you. Now, I think all of those can be dispatched, at least in the space of 30 pages. I tried to do it in the paper. And when you do it, it doesn't look like there's much reason not to believe, at least at the object level, not much reason left to doubt Kelsen's thesis that law is an instrument. You might, however, want to kick the argument upstairs one story and say, with Dworkin and Fuller, and in some moods Finnis, well, that's all very well, Green, but you're missing the second order point. Maybe the law's not merely means to an end, but I'll tell you what jurisprudence is. Jurisprudence is a means to an end. Its purpose is to direct energies, that's a quotation you know from Fuller, to inspire, that's a quotation from Ronnie Dworkin, to console, that's a quotation from my mother, to help judges, or quotation from me, to be fun. Jurisprudence is a means to an end. It's not truth normed, it's not truth apt. And so we get instrumentalism of jurisprudence. And then at the meta level, this filters back to the object level along a line of argument pursued by Liam Murphy. The title of his article says it all. Better to think of law that way is the title of his argument. Namely, we ought to think about law in the way that would be instrumentally best to think about law. That certainly doesn't follow from instrumentalism of the kind I defend, and it seems like a very odd thesis on the face of it. So I end not with a refutation of that thesis, but with an exhortation. There is a second order thesis about instrumentalism, one about the meta level, the science of jurisprudence, rather than about the science of law. Jurisprudence using it in the English sense now, using it in one of the two English senses, theory of philosophy of law, theory of law. Jurisprudence has its own internal morality, just as Fuller thought law had. But it consists of a set of epistemic virtues. Accuracy to the phenomena, consilience, coherence, simplicity, and so forth. Of its nature, jurisprudence comes with a built-in aim to know the truth about the nature of law. And moreover, this built-in aim of jurisprudence is self-embracing, because it includes knowing the truth of the nature of general jurisprudence. So that's the shape of the argument. It's not a summary of the argument, it's the skeleton of the argument. We begin by trying to persuade you that everybody not insane thinks that law works in the world of means and ends. Some legislation about the relationship between means and ends to specify the thesis more narrowly. A suggestion about how law might have, two suggestions about how law might have non-instrumental value, might have dependent intrinsic value historically, path-dependently, or organically. A refutation of 5 familiar and tempting errors that seem to stand in the way of accepting the thesis less refined, and then kicking out the ladder for those who want to make the ascent to the second order level and let it drip back down and infect our concept of law itself. That's it.
Okay, thank you.